Now, when we look at Genesis, we read about the first kingdom in Genesis chapter 10. And we know that this kingdom was created by Babel, and its builder was Nimrod. And we read, Nimrod began to be a mighty one in the earth, and the beginning of his kingdom was Babel, and Erech, and Akkad, and Calneh in the land of Shinar. Out of that land he went forth into Ashur, and builded Nineveh, and the city of Rehoboth, and Calah, and Rezin, in Genesis 10:10-11. And so Nimrod created the first kingdom that was based in the land of Shinar, and part of that kingdom included the city of Akkad, but then he went and conquered the land of Ashur, and he built some more cities. And so Babel becomes the prototypical Babylon, and we'll see this as we go along. Now, if we study history, we'll realize that Shinar, according to secular history, is called Sumer. When we study the history of Sumer, we find that there was two dynasties. One was based in Babel, and the other one was based in Akkad, which is one of the cities that Nimrod built. In this picture on the right, we can see a 2,500-year-old stone carving of Nimrod holding a lion. The Sumerians didn't call him Nimrod, they called him Gilgamesh in their language. But this is still Nimrod, and it's interesting to see the size of the lion relative to the size of Nimrod. But animals have suffered less from the effects of sin, although they still suffered, than man has. Now, what do we learn about Nimrod? Well, first of all, Nimrod magnified himself above God. The Bible tells us he was a mighty hunter against the Lord. Now, what he did is that he created a new world order. Before there were no kingdoms, and he set up a kingdom ruled by a king himself. And he did this by training men in the use of arms and creating the first armies. And because nobody else knew what an army was, he was quite easily able to conquer all of the surrounding tribes and create his kingdom. One of the benefits that he had is that everybody spoke one common language. And he introduced the worship of mother and child, and all of these points come back. They all prefigured or foreshadowed what was to come. Nimrod also instigated the worship of the sun and the moon, and Sunday worship. Now, after God had confused their tongues, while the people of the earth dispersed, not everybody left the land of Shinar or the land of Ashur. Some people remained there, and those that remained there were ruled over by a new king based in the city of Akkad instead of the city of Babel, which is where Nimrod was ruling from. In Genesis, after reading about Babel, we read about another kingdom. And we read about this kingdom in Genesis 14. The king that was head over this kingdom was called Chedorlaomer. Now, this is a gold statue on the right of a king of Elam. Now, we don't know which king it was, but it's about the right time frame, about 1500 BC, 2000 to 1500 BC. And again, we notice the size of the goat relative to the size of the man. It's quite interesting. We read in Genesis, and it came to pass in the days of Aramphel king of Shinar, Arioch king of Elasar, Chedorlaomer king of Elam, and Tidal king of nations, that these made war with Bera king of Sodom, and with Bersha king of Gomorrah, Shinab king of Admah, and Shemeber king of Zeboim, and the king of Bela, which is Zoar. And 12 years they served Chedorlaomer. So what we see here is that the king of Elam, either through conquest or through alliances with these other kings of Elasar and Shinar, actually ruled over all of them. And those kings all got together and went to conquer Canaan. And we know what happened because he ran into Abraham. Before we talk about Abraham, let's go back and look at secular history. What does it tell us about this kingdom? Well, there's a 4,000-year-old text in cuneiform called the Curse of Agade. And this text that has been found tells us how the Akkadian dynasty was actually overthrown by a tribe called the Gutians that came from the east. Now, soon after the Gutians and destroyed the city of Akkad, they were followed by another tribe called the Elamites, who established themselves as the regional power. And so they took over and ruled in the land of Shinar, or Sumer. It was during this period of Elamite rule that Abraham was called out of Mesopotamia, which had been the kingdom of Nimrod. And so this is where Abraham goes into the promised land. And we read in Patriarchs and Prophets, page 127, that the call from heaven first came to Abraham while he dwelt in Ur of the Chaldees. It was a large company that set out from Mesopotamia. And so this is a regional map that we can have a look at. On the map you can see Sumer, which is a small part of Nimrod's empire, Mesopotamia, from which Abraham came out of. Now, if you look on the far right, you'll see that Gutia is to the far right of Mesopotamia, and Elam is also to the right, but it's to the south. After the Elamites had ruled over Sumer and had tried to conquer Canaan, we next read about another kingdom that arises from Genesis chapter 41 all the way through to 1 King chapter 15. And this kingdom was actually Egypt. We're told that now there arose a new king over Egypt, which knew not Joseph. Therefore they did set over them taskmasters to afflict them with their burdens, in Exodus chapter 1, verses 8 and 11. And Egypt was actually quite a strong regional power, quite a strong kingdom. And even though the Exodus sort of devastated Egypt for a while, they recouped their power. And so we read in 1 Kings chapter 14, for example, that it came to pass that Shishak, king of Egypt, came up against Jerusalem. And he took away the treasures of the house of the Lord, and the treasures of the king's house, he even took away all. So all these kingdoms have a bearing upon God's people. In some way or another, they afflict God's people. And we see that Egypt extended past the Red Sea and actually the entire coast of Palestine, all the way right up into the north near the Hittite Empire. And Egypt ruled from about 1500 to about 1200 BC. Now Egypt as a power came from the west. Egyptian history tells us that they had one great king called Menes, who unified the various tribes of Egypt into a nation and created the first kingdom. We don't know very much about him, but essentially ever after there was always tension between what was known as Upper and Lower Egypt. Now, while the Gutians and Elamites had overthrown the Akkadian dynasty and invaded the land of Shinar, they didn't destroy Babylon. They actually ruled from Babel. It was only during the Egyptian Empire that Babylon was destroyed. And it was actually destroyed not by the Egyptians, but by the Hittites, who were actually in alliance with Egypt. And so Babylon was destroyed during the time of the Third Kingdom. And this is an important detail. We're going to come back to this as well. In fact, we're going to come back to all of these points. Now, one thing we know about Egypt is that they had advanced scientific knowledge. And we read about the proverbial wisdom of the Egyptians in 1 Kings chapter 4:30. Their scientific knowledge was so advanced, in fact, that we still don't know how they were able to build the pyramids. And the pyramids are only a small part of it. There are texts found in papyrus dating from about 1400 BC that actually describe the way the brain works. Not only that, but there are found granite bowls. And granite is the hardest stone. It's very, very hard to carve. Perfectly shaped that balance on a pinhead. And we can't do this today. So they had advanced scientific knowledge. The other aspect of Egypt is that they primarily had a secular culture. On one hand, it was pantheistic and they worshipped just about everything that moved. On the other hand, it was quite atheistic. And we know this is the case because when Moses went to Pharaoh and said, "Let my people go," Pharaoh said, "Who's God? Who is he that I should obey him?" What tends to happen when you have lots and lots of gods is that they all become rather insignificant. And so this culture becomes quite secular. Secular culture doesn't have to be atheistic. It can be religious, but religion, while perhaps being very prominent, plays a secondary role as a motivating power. And this is what Egyptian culture was like. About this time, during the Third Kingdom, some drastic changes happen to God's people. First change is that there's a reorganization. Under Moses, the church in the wilderness, as we're told in the New Testament, the church in the wilderness became independent. It had been subservient to Egypt, but it becomes independent, an independent state, an independent nation. And it was reorganized away from the patriarchal model to a Levitical priesthood. So there's two main changes that happen as part of that reorganization. At the same time, about the middle of this Egyptian period, while David and Solomon were ruling, the church, or Israel, prospered materially. And the third thing that happened is that towards the end of this period, of the Third Kingdom, or the Egyptian kingdom, is that Israel fell away from faithfulness and began imitating the surrounding nations and adopted worship of pagan gods soon after Solomon had passed away. So under this Third Kingdom we have this entire transition of God's church from its reorganization, it's becoming independent, becomes prosperous and then falls away. And again, we're going to come back to this. These things are all types, of which the antitype is the real fulfillment. Egypt was succeeded by another kingdom. And we read about this kingdom in 2 Kings. We sort of move past Genesis now. And in 2 Kings chapter 15 to 23, we read about this fourth kingdom. And this fourth kingdom was Assyria. And on the right you have a diagram of the way the Assyrian soldiers used to dress. Probably the most well-known king is the king called Sennacherib. And we read in 2 Kings 15:29, in the days of Pekah, king of Israel, came Tiglath-Pileser, king of Assyria, and took Kedesh and Hazor and Gilead and Galilee, all the land of Naphtali, and carried them away to Assyria. And now in the 14th year of King Hezekiah, did Sennacherib, king of Assyria, come up against all the fenced cities of Judah and took them, in 2 Kings 18:13. In fact, not only did he come up against Jerusalem, but he carried away 200,000 captives. So this is the fourth kingdom that afflicts God's people. Now if we look at the Assyrian Empire here, the map, it lasted from about 1200 BC to about 627 BC, and you can see that it was based up here in the north where Nineveh is, and it came south and took Babylon, and then Palestine and Egypt. It pushed southeast towards Elam. It was a proud, ruthless nation. It was famous for the fact that when it conquered a nation, it either killed everybody in the entire nation, or those who weren't killed were deported. And the land was left absolutely desolate. It was the first nation to be this ruthless. Assyria was initially Israel's ally. In fact, the relationship between Israel and Assyria began because King Ahab actually asked Assyria to be its ally against the king of Damascus, or Syria. But eventually, Assyria got sick of Israel and destroyed it. So, while starting out being its friend, ends up being its enemy. And Assyria carried away 10 tribes of Israel and besieged Jerusalem during the time of Hezekiah. Now, perhaps most importantly, is that Assyria actually relocated its capital to Babylon and accepted the religion of Babylon. And in so doing, actually became an image of Babylon that was to come. And this is a very, very, very important point, which we'll come back to. So, as a summary map, we notice that we started off talking about Babel or Babylon, and we noticed that Elam came from the east and pushed west. Egypt came from the west and pushed to the east. and Assyria came from the north and pushed south.